Were you afraid of driving when you first started? And did you find that you're no longer as afraid after you've done it many times? If so, you've done successful exposure therapy for anxiety. Let's figure out how you can use exposure therapy to overcome social anxiety. Hi, I'm Dr. Thomas Smithyman. I'm a clinical psychologist and I specialize in social anxiety. In this video, we're going to talk about exposure therapy for social anxiety. We'll talk about what it is, we're going to talk about why it works, how it works, and also how you can start to apply it in ways that will help you overcome your social anxiety. We are built as humans to respond to anxiety by backing away and protecting. This is how we're built. The downside of that is this actually makes our anxiety worse over time. It gets worse and worse the more we avoid and protect. So this takes us to exposure therapy, which is trying to do the opposite of that. Instead of avoiding, it has us slowly moving forward to face our fears, and in doing so, reducing anxiety. Exposure therapy is that. We're trying to find a way of moving towards the things we're afraid of. And we want to do it again and again. We want to do it for as long as we can in each session. And we want to make sure that we're not preventing it from working by protecting or avoiding too much. And what you do find is if you can face something again and again for as long as you can, without backing away, without protecting, your anxiety initially goes up and then it starts to come down. This is the traditional model of exposure therapy. In general, with graduated exposure, you start with stuff that's it's easier. Like it makes you anxious but not super anxious. And then over time you escalate up to more and more difficult things. This is largely because exposure therapy is difficult and we don't want to torture you. So we'll start with easier stuff. After you've had some successes, you've done a few easy things and you've succeeded and you've noticed your anxiety come down, the harder stuff is actually not so bad. So an example might be starting with calling up an old friend. So this is a social anxiety example. Call up an old friend on the phone. Maybe you haven't talked to them in a while. It's a little bit of anxiety there, but you know them, you've been friends in the past. It's not so bad. And that might be a lower end thing, and a higher end thing might be making a speech in public in front of people that you don't know, or sometimes even worse, people you do know. So when you do exposure therapy, if you do it properly, it is, you could say it's the most powerful thing we have in psychology, the most powerful treatment. When I say when done correctly, because there's a lot of nuance to this, and picking the right way to do things. Knowing the principles is important, but applying it requires some nuance. If done well, it is great, and honestly there's not going to be a way of successfully treating social anxiety without doing some version of exposure. If you don't kind of follow the guidelines, or you do it badly, it can either not work, which is very frustrating, or it can actually make things worse. So why does it work? Like, what exactly is it doing that's so useful? It does a lot of things, and depending on the research and who you ask, you get a number of different answers. Your emotional brain can face something enough times that it gets bored of it, and in this way it's no longer anxious. Like the idea of watching a horror movie 10 times in a row, your brain just gets used to it, gets bored of it, it's no longer as afraid. It also, because you're not being dominated by your fears, and instead you're moving through and towards things. That feels very powerful. It feels assertive. So pride increases. We don't feel as dominated. It helps us realize that we can handle challenges. It helps us realize we can feel discomfort without it knocking us over and controlling us. All of that stuff's very, very powerful. But when it comes to talking about this with social anxiety, you really want to emphasize that exposure helps change your thoughts, your cognitions. It helps change your understanding of the social world, which is really important. This is most important for social anxiety, since the cognitive angles have been shown to be more effective than just straight up exposure. So with the cognitive changes that happen with exposure, what's really happening is your anxious brain has very unrealistic beliefs about the way the social world works. And we know it does, it's built to. Like, our emotional brain is built on a better safe than sorry system. So it prefers us to overestimate the dangers and avoid it, rather than underestimating and having something bad happen. So it is built this way. We know, and I want you to expect your predictions and beliefs around threats to be exaggerated. Look for it, be skeptical, because it's there. In general, the two big beliefs that we're testing out with exposure is, right, it's really two. It's overestimating, so the overestimating bias and the catastrophizing bias. When we do exposure, we are testing out these beliefs. So if you were never to face something, if you were always to back away, you wouldn't get a chance to test whether those predictions are exaggerated or not. So exposure allows us to test that out. And in another video in this series, I'll get into the real deep specifics of how to go about questioning those beliefs. But in general, what we're looking to do is we're changing those two things. So let's take the example of initiating a conversation with a stranger. So overestimating bias, this is the documented tendency for us to overestimate the likelihood that something will go wrong. So in initiating conversation with a stranger, that's most likely fears of, I'm going to screw up, I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to do really badly. In some way, my flaws are going to be revealed to this person, and they're going to have a bad response. So it's the overestimation would be basically exaggerating the odds that you're going to screw up. And the second belief, the catastrophizing, that would basically be, it's when it goes badly, it's not just going to go badly, it's going to be a catastrophe. It'll be terrible. Rather than being like, oh, that was annoying, it's going to be, this is devastating. And I cannot handle it. It's too much for me. So in that example of the initiating with a stranger, then it's not that, oh, you know, I used a few of the wrong words, I stumbled a little bit, and it was fine, and we got to the end of the conversation. Catastrophizing would be, they're going to really notice it, it's going to be a big deal to them, and they're going to be grossed out by me, or they're going to like reject me or be disgusted by me, and I will be devastated and cannot handle it. So when you do exposure, if you go and do that, like you go and initiate with 10 strangers over the course of a couple of weeks, you'll find, like most of my people I work with do, yeah, you will probably screw up to a certain extent some of the time, but not all the time. And when you do screw up, it's not massive. You don't you're not like you make a terrible, terrible impression. You just screw up a little bit here and there. And on the other piece of it, the people, instead of being disgusted and grossed out and trying to get away from you, you tend to find most of the time they're pretty neutral. Some of them are probably nice, positive. Maybe you'll get a negative one occasionally, but by doing exposure and facing it again and again, you get to update those predictions to be more realistic. So this process of trying to make this emotional brain more realistic, that's part of what you're getting with exposure. After all, you tend to think of things in a more realistic way. Okay, so how to go about applying this. I'll get into more detail on how to do this in the future, but for now, think of it in this way. Backing away and hiding makes the anxiety worse. So we're really essentially trying to do the opposite of that. So basically do exposure therapy by slowly moving towards things you're afraid of. You don't have to do everything, it doesn't have to be perfect, but when you have a choice between I could back away here or I could move forward, make the choice to move forward. If anxiety tells you don't say anything at all, then try saying a little bit. If anxiety says, I'm only going to talk to my friend, don't engage with anybody else, try to move out of that and say hi to one person. Find little opportunities to not do what the anxiety wants you to do. Do things that are a little bit scary. If there's a party or something that you're worried about going to, if you go to that party, even if you're there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even if you don't really say too much, you're still doing exposure therapy. So the good news is, do enough of these little things, they start to add up. Sometimes I'll talk about it as though it's like getting points. You can do a lot of small challenges and still get some points that way. And if you look for these opportunities of where you can challenge yourself and move towards your fear rather than away, you can make a big impact eventually, because that stuff all adds up. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Please subscribe and then comment if you have any questions. Okay, thank you.